Okie. Itamix Ganatoni. Good morning. It is about 10:15 in the AM on Sunday, January 5th, 2020, in the lunar cycle Misamikoko Miatos. And I've just pulled into the parking lot above the Alexander Wilderness Park. Just pulled in to eat a bagel sandwich from Tim Hortons. I bought a bagel belt, bacon, egg, lettuce, tomato sandwich on a spinach and matzo bagel. But when I pulled in here, I noticed this little bird sitting on a rail, and this bird happens to be a northern shrike, which is, to me, interesting. I've never had a winter where I've seen so many northern shrikes. This morning, like on most Sundays, I went to Shpobikimi, and when we were passing by the Owlwood, Carol and I, on our way back from going to see the yucca plants like we usually do, we heard this trilling, almost robin-like, but not quite, in the forest, and I saw this almost robin-sized bird, and then it flew up to the high-level bridge, and it had a partner, and that partner flew up with it. And I was trying to guess what it was. I was like, so it kind of looks like a robin, kind of looks like a starling, but not, I thought it was something different. And then we heard some more of the same kind of trilling in the forest, and we tracked it down, and it turned out to be another shrike. So I believe this one that I'm looking at here, the entrance to Alexander Wilderness Park, is actually the fourth shrike that I've come across just this morning. And that's a lot of shrikes. So I don't know what the deal is with them. Not a whole lot else was going on at the pond that I saw this morning. The only other thing that I took any video of was a couple of mergansers, the male mergansers that's been hanging out with the geese there just north of the high-level bridge. That male merganser seems to have come up with a partner, and so yeah, it was kind of cute. So I videotaped him and his lady among the geese this morning. At least I'm assuming that it's the same one, same merganser. You may have noticed I'm wielding a new camera here as I was just recording the shrike. This is the little Sony HD Handycam that I've been eyeballing, wanting to try to see if it fared against lower temperatures better than my old dinosaur Handycam, that was having issues of all kinds. But this should allow me to get closer to wildlife, to get us some good views of the wildlife that I'm often describing in a way that the of course the little action cams, the little blogger cams, and GoPros and such can't do. Hey, so I wanted something with the little telephoto lens on it. And I've been looking at this little camera, which was $300 on the shelves. Been watching it for a while. Looked at it on Amazon and stuff. And then just yesterday, I was out at London Drugs here in town. I was picking up some allergy meds for Chelsea, and I just walked past to see if they still had these cameras, and I found that they were $100 off until January 9th or 11th or something like that. So a $300 camera, $100 off. I paid $200 for it. I'm not going to get a better price than that for a new one of those. So even though I didn't really have the money to be spending on it, I took advantage of the opportunity and went ahead with it. And so now we get to test it out a little bit today, as I've been doing already. So yeah, let's pull down into the wilderness park here and see what's up down that way. I also have a actually I should pull that up now while we're on the top. I have a kind of a philosophical question. I don't know if I'd call it philosophical question, but I have a complicated question to address from a student in my phenology class. And let me just see if I can pull up what he said. This has been kind of a back and forth between us, and it relates to a video where I think it's titled Human or Earthling, that I posted not too long back, end of November. And so the comment, one of the comments that came up after the student had considered it, or the phenology participant had considered it for a while, said, one question I've been mulling over a lot is there still nature in the political or racial identities we are forming as earthlings? You know, if you watch that video, you'll understand what he's saying. Is there still nature in the political or racial identities we are forming as earthlings? It seems to me that such identities don't just appear in our heads from nowhere. They must be made and remade through relations of some material, something natural in the world, e.g. being Canadian apparently involves grabbing a stick and whacking a rubber thing across ice. What makes those material relations so different from the plants and animals we try to relate to as phenologists? Is it the fact that they involve plants and animals and objects that are not local to where we are living? E.g. the wood for the stick is from BC, the rubber for the puck is from Brazil. If so, why is localness important? And what happens when we consider that the plants and animals of our sites may themselves be formed through non-local relations involving humans? Obvious examples include genetic modified plants or domesticated animals. So a lot of complicated questions there that I need to consider, and I think I'll do that as we're walking in the wilderness park today, although we'll see how the wind is. If the wind is too brutal, I won't be doing much narrative, but I've waited about a week to respond to that. It's time for me to do it, so I think today will hopefully be our day. Not that I know what I'm gonna say, all that I'm gonna say, but I got some this and that to contribute to the conversation. hanging out here in this blind. I thought this would be a quiet place to come, little shelter from the wind. As it turns out, though, the wind plays this thing like an instrument, and it's very creaky. Lots of creaks and groans from this wood. Still a cool place to come and hang out and make a little recording in response to the phenology student's question, and maybe get lucky while we're here and some deer will turn up. I saw the few, maybe a doe and a couple of her fawns from this year, something like that, whitetails on my way in. No idea what they were eating or anything. Kind of scared them off to take my position here, but this is a thoroughfare, so we may see more. Any case, let's get down to the nitty-gritty with that stream of, well, I think there's maybe two big questions in there and a lot of little stuff. So the first question seems to be, I mean, we could even relate it to this structure, right? This blind. I mean, some might view this as a natural structure, and some might view it as unnatural, and kind of a something that tarnishes the forest here in its unnaturalness. Anyone who would view this as unnatural, in my opinion, is mistaken. So it seems that at the heart of the initial question that was raised was a misunderstanding that what I was saying in my video about the change that's going on in our identity, which is basically this. I feel that we are shifting from having a human identity and living as humans to having an identity as earthlings and living as such, and that those are two different things, and that they are based on two different kinds of, like, very different sets of relations. And when we're human, when we say we're human, that is in relation to many other life forms. You know, could be in relation to these trees and the grass, you know, could be it's in relation to all of these other species and life forms, and even those, you know, in other places, on other planets and such. Being human doesn't mean, you know, that you're only in relation to, that's an identity that's only in relation to the immediate environment. It's a relation is like one to other species, I believe. Right? We're humans. And so what does it mean to be human? And this is a question that many cultures have explored for thousands of years, and the Blackfoot tradition is no different. There's been some response to this question. What is it to be human? And that's part of what I try to explore a bit in this phenology course. And part of what that last video was about, in terms of what is, you know, like in Blackfoot, what is Matapi? Is it just humans? You know, I don't think it is. I think it's all, you know, life forms. But we see ourselves in relation to all these others when we're human. when we're earthlings, we see ourselves in relation to those of other planets. And that's what I think we're moving toward, is an earthling identity. And in the midst of that shift, we adopt really human-centric identities that aren't in relation to these other species, but are just in relation to each other as human beings. And so our holidays shift, whereas once we had all of these phenologically oriented holidays. You know, the reason that December 25th is an important date is because of celebrations of the sun returning, a phenological event. Easter, similarly. You know, the Hallmark didn't make up the Easter bunny, like I've said many, many times, and didn't make up the egg hunt either. These were the indigenous traditions that have been now masked by other kinds of celebrations of a man god, basically a god in the form of a man, and celebration of ourselves. So we have new holidays like birthdays and memorials to various human events. We're shifting away from our relations to all these others. We're shifting away from our human identity into something else. And in that transition, we've got these identities like race and nationality and such like this, because we're globalizing, right? This is the identity shift we're taking. I never said that this was unnatural. And I never said that these identities were arising outside of relations. What I'm saying is that the relations that they're arising in are different than what it is to have a human identity. And a human identity is in relation to all of these others, all of these other species. Not in relation, to other nations and other races and these kind of things. These are some of the identities being taken in the big shift in identity, and all that I've said is I've not called it unnatural. What I've said is that it's very experimental, and we don't know where it's leading us. I made a video some years ago about this notion of legacy, because a lot of people are interested in, doing their life's work to create their legacy, and they have in mind that, they're going to be remembered. But the reality is that, how many people could you name, individuals could you name, who were alive at a certain period, say 2010 years ago? We're not going to be remembered. That's not what our legacy is. We don't need to worry about ourselves as individuals. Oh, there's a white-tailed buck coming. Hold on, I'm gonna return to this thought, but I'm gonna record this buck. There's a couple of deer coming. Hold on. Gick. I'll switch cameras. Well, my cover's definitely blown to all the whitetails out there, but I don't think they care so much. They're lingering right out here. The herd is just out this way, and I have a feeling they're gonna stick around. They came so close. If I had been just a little bit more concealed rather than just standing in the middle of the open area of this blind, if I just conceal myself a little bit, you know, I think they would have potentially stuck around here and maybe munched a few leaves or something so we could see, but I blew it. I'm in teaching mode, you know. I didn't even catch the deer until the buck was kind of staring my way. Anyhow, back to the point I was making about legacy. You know, our real legacy is not what as individuals will be remembered for in our individual works, but I think our real legacy is what is going to be inherited in the future by our descendants. And that could be any distance into the future. And there are things like, you know, I myself suffer from a genetic you know, I don't want to call it a mutation, but I got bad eyesight. I got nearsightedness. And it's so bad that I basically am blind without some kind of corrective something. So I wear contact lenses. Most of, you know, growing up I had glasses. And glasses you know, signal to the world that you have this genetic issue that renders you, you know, less capable of a lot of things that you're expected to do in among us, you know. So it's a sign. Hey, I don't want to say genetic defect, but basically I'm a genetic defect. I'm a genetic defect. And what I found out when I was 16 years old is that my mom finally bought me a pair of contact lenses, and it changed my life, like dramatically, almost overnight, to where I could hide the genetic defect, and suddenly I had girlfriends, and it also helped that I got a new wardrobe and a haircut that same time. But I think the issue with the glasses was a big deal, and I can go by in the world now with my vision corrected, either by surgery or by contact lenses or what have you, and I can hide a genetic defect, what would be considered a genetic defect, and so that defect carries on into the population into the future. Are we going to come to a day when all of us are born basically blind and in need of surgical manipulation so that we can have this thing that our ancestors had called vision? You know, some things like that I would consider legacy, right? And living as a human being in relation to all of these others, I feel like when you're doing that, you have all of this available wealth of learning from the elders who have been here so much, you know, so long. And I guess that brings to mind, well, what about, you know, what about some of these, like this brome grass? Maybe this brome grass didn't come from here. but now it's all over the forest. You know, what about that? What about these invasive plants? I think that was part of kind of the questioning. You know, when we're looking at our sites, how have our sites been affected by humans and animals and plants and such from other places? And that's really not my point either. My point, you know, as a beaver man, I'm watching all of these plants and animals, including the ones that have more recently arrived here. I don't carry the narrative that the Western agricultural industrial complex is pushing, where those populations, where those other, you know, species that have kind of recently become inhabitants here at this location, I don't see them as invasive, noxious, whatever the heck that is. It's a very negative thing. It's sort of knocking back here. I don't use the war trope in my understanding of, you know, who they are. I go back to being human, and I look at them and I see that they are fitting. Oh, that there is a human out here. We're gonna go see what this guy's up to pretty soon here, but I saw him earlier. And I started wondering if I was just imagining or what. But there's a guy in a yellow coat way out that way. He's been doing something for a while. You know, basically since I've been in the blind, and maybe before that. Anyhow, yeah, my own perspective is that a lot of these, like, I'm looking to them again still as elders, because maybe their species or their kind has been here a lot longer than us, and maybe not here, but maybe you know, look at how they're fitting in the ecosystem. Even the ones that seem to like displace a lot of native plants, and the reality is we're becoming a global community. So among the plants and the animals, all of this is going to be played out as you know, as much as it is being played out among ourselves. We are not detached. What we are doing is not detached from what's occurring in the natural world, so to speak. And there we go. Like, I don't really believe in the distinction, the natural world versus the human world, right? That's not really my point. And if when I fall back on that language, I try to catch myself. It just comes out of bad habit, you know, from being enculturated in the mainstream. I think I lost track of my next point here, but yeah, it's never my intention to say that something is not natural. My intention is to say that do we know, you know, where we're going with that? Should we? Does it matter to us? Are we just going with it? Is it happening? You know, are we? You know, because it is happening with the plants and the other animals and stuff too. It always has been. Like, everybody's always moved around, but now everybody's moving around fast. And so species that are going to do well in certain environments, in certain, niches, and with certain sources of food and such. Of course, there's not going to be any stopping them. That's going to happen now because of how we're moving around on the planet. And is it mainly us? I don't know. Birds are moving. They always have been. So, am I saying that something's unnatural? No. But I am saying that our identity is shifting. And I'm interested still in being human. I'm really not so interested in the earthling identity. I find myself very thoughtfully entertained in life, visiting with and learning from the elders in these localized places, and watching, observing, what goes on in cycles, and what those cycles are. They're not just necessarily sun cycles and moon cycles. There are other cycles. Learning those cycles, to me, it's becoming a part of the place as a human being, not as an earthling. Is that better than being an earthling? That's not what I'm saying. I think one in this phenological tradition would certainly become much more aware of the immediate environment, and that can have its advantages in all kinds of different situations. But being an earthling has its advantages too, primarily in economic ways, which is highly motivating. It's the reason for language shift, in my opinion. There was one other thing I remember I wanted to talk about in relation to this question, and it might now just be kind of a non sequitur, but I'll mention it because it relates, and I'll probably leave it at that for this round of response to the discussion that's going on. In the early 1900s, you got an anthropologist named Clark Whistler, who had taken over as director of the Natural History Museum in Central Park in New York, taken over from Franz Boas, who had started anthropology in the Americas. So Whistler was his successor of the museum, and Ruth Benedict was his successor in the anthropology department at Columbia University. But Whistler got very interested in this question about why is it that when we're visiting these various indigenous cultures, you can have one tribe that you're visiting, and they have all of these cultural traits, these material objects. And those cultural traits, but not just material objects, but certain stories and certain social organizations and certain ceremonial complex and such, but all of these, including the material objects, are cultural traits. Just like the hockey stick in the example of the question that was posed. For Canada, this is a cultural trait, the hockey game, and the equipment that goes with it. Complex of traits. Now, in one tribe, you can have this whole complex of traits, and a neighboring tribe can have an extremely similar complex of traits. Can be just almost the same. You know? But then a neighbor on the other side, perhaps, has an entirely different set of cultural traits with not so much similarity. I mean, quite different. Hey? So, for instance, you know, in real life example here, in Blackfoot territory, say the Blackfoot culture and all of its traits is more, you know, has more in common with Grovon, for instance, than it does with the Salish, who are on the other side of the mountains. But the neighbors, their immediate neighbors, both of them. So why is it? Why is it that one immediate neighbor can have a cultural complex that's very similar, and another one has it? Another immediate neighbor has very different. And so Clark Whistler's students and Clark himself started working with Blackfoot elders in investigating this question. They did a very thorough study of Blackfoot cultural traits at the time. So you have Clark Whistler's ethnography work and John Ewer's ethnography work and Claude Schaefer, and they actually start a Smithsonian-linked museum in Browning, Montana, on the southern Blackfeet Reserve. So they have a base of operations to carry out this study of Blackfoot cultural traits, really detailed, and then use that as a basis of comparison with others. But they talked to a lot of elders and such, and what they ended up coming out with in the long run was something called culture area theory. And culture area theory is basically that you have these areas where the culture traits are very similar, much more similar than they are to any ways outside of that area, right? And so you can look at like North America and you can separate it into these culture areas, and this is where the language came from when we say Plains culture, or Great Basin culture, or Northwest Coast culture, California coast culture, or Southwest culture. All of these, when we're referring to, what we're referring to are these culture areas that Whistler and them came up with. And what they found was the basis of the similitude between groups in a particular culture area. The basis of that similitude was in their subsistence. What was their primary subsistence resource? In the plains, it was bison. So everybody that was living primarily off of bison shared a lot of cultural traits. On the Northwest coast, it was salmon. So everybody that's living primarily off of salmon shares a lot of cultural traits. You know, in some areas it's camas root, and everybody shares cultural traits. This is what it was linked to. Ultimately was subsistence. What is your primary subsistence resource? And that's going to determine in some way or be strongly related to the way of life that you have. Now, what's interesting is that Whistler and Ewers and them never turned that lens back on themselves, on the mainstream culture, and asked, well, what the heck are we doing then? What is our resource that gives us the commonality? Or is there? Like, what is it? What is it? What's going on with this colonizing, globalizing culture? Because it's a different thing. It's not linked to one primary subsistence resource, or is it? Or is it? It's another question to ask. But that'll be my response for now. And I'm going to head around the river, the bend, and see if we can get a couple of views of some wildlife before I take off for home. So I'm headed out toward the area where I seen the dude with the orange jacket or yellow jacket, and it looks like what's going on out here is it's kind of building a cabin structure. Using some of the beaver felled logs, perhaps. Be interested to see what he does with it, whether it keeps building. I don't see him out here at the moment, but he might be hiding out. Continue my way through. Nobody much in terms of waterfowl, which means I'm not likely to see eagles or anything either. But I'll continue along kind of the river trail, make a loop. Lot of thoughts being triggered. I don't think John Trudell was off the mark when he called it a mining culture. You know, mining energy. Now, in one respect, this is the primary exchange that makes life possible, is energy. Energy from the sun, captured by these plants, converted into sugars, into these forms that the deer can eat, and we can eat the deer. It's an energy exchange. And so in some respect, we're all after the energy, you know. But the mining culture, what's different, I think, is that there's not a sense of obligation to reciprocate for what's taken. You know, you consider what was going on with the Aztecs and the kind of human sacrifice that they made. You know, I think they made that sacrifice because they knew they were taking such a great deal in urbanizing as they did. The giving has to, the reciprocation has to match what you're taking. And in the mining culture, we don't even give back our shit and piss. We we might separate the water from it, put the water back into the system, but we try to keep everything that's ours. And up until just last year, the only even two options for what to do with the body at death would be cremation or burial. Last year in Lethbridge, they legalized the shroud, which I'll take advantage of, certainly, if that's my only option. I'd rather just utilize the forest, but yeah, we don't give back anything in the mining culture. And I think that's part of the difference when we start down that road of globalization. When we separate ourselves from where we get our resources. This is the difference between local and non-local, right? At a local level, a big part of the reason to learn phenology is so that you can succeed to live in this local environment with the resources that are here, and that you learn the cycles of their availability and how to play your human role in this environment in taking advantage of those cycles. Some of those plants need us to harvest in order to carry on their healthy propagation. We've been a part of their life for a long time. These kind of things, when we globalize, we separate ourselves from all of these local relationships, and people don't see them. So when you ask the typical member of the global culture to come out here and speak about what's going on out here with all of these species, they won't know them, and they don't know what's going on. So there's a loss of connection to the local, and a loss of a sense, I think, in that there needs to be a reciprocation, because when your life is linked to what's right here, and you can see before your eyes the ramifications of abusing that resource, and you feel it, the hit. It's different than when you're in a global market. Our global food trade is something else, man. It saves us from all kinds of hardship. And if you look around the world, we're actually all mostly, I think, in a state of famine. Certainly here on the plains we are. There's not enough food to sustain the local population. We have to rely on the global food trade. And when we're relying on the global food trade, what are we given in return for what we're getting is just money. And its value is very different, than than the value we might have for the gifts that we might give, or the things that we might do, because we rely on something for our lives. Yeah, we rely on the global food trade for our lives, but it doesn't feel like we have to. It feels like we should try to get as much as we can for as little as possible, and that's capitalism, right? We should try to get as much as we can. That's negative reciprocity. And that's what's missing. When you move away from the local, you lose the reciprocity. And so then you become this mining culture that all it does is take, and it doesn't give back. And that's very experimental. I'm not saying it's unnatural. I'm saying where does that lead? Is that where we want to go? It's not really where I'm interested in going. I'm interested in looking at what's going to be our legacy. How can we try our best to give a better human experience to our descendants down the line, and to all the others that, and their descendants who we've been coexisting living with. I don't know. Those kind of value-laden things come into it for me, but in there I think there's also some very objective thoughts regarding what's the difference between the local and the global, and what is the global about? What is that Western culture about? What is it? Why is it different? If all these other human cultures, their culture traits are really based on what it is that they're most reliant on for subsistence, what is that mainstream culture? And like I say, I don't think Trudell was off the mark. Onward. Famous psychologist Abraham Maslow, very early in his career, 1938, spent 6 weeks on the Siksika Reserve in northern Blackfoot Territory. And he came there with this idea that all human societies arrange themselves hierarchically, that those hierarchies are put in place and kept in place through relationships of dominance and submission, and that it's our nature to be competitive and sometimes injurious, to put ourselves higher in the hierarchy. And he tested this idea with questionnaires in New York among students and such. And Ruth Benedict, an anthropologist, challenged him to come out here and test it in a Blackfoot context. And he did. What he found was he was stonewalled in his questionnaire because people didn't want to answer things that would require them to speak bad about other people. And a lot of his questions required that. It was part of his gauging whether someone had strong ego security, and were up in the higher ranks of the hierarchy, right? They would have to talk bad about people. Who's the biggest thief? Who's the biggest liar? He couldn't get Blackfoot subjects to do that, but he did perceive that most people had strong ego security, but it's of a different sort, because they didn't put other people down, yet they felt very confident. They kind of gave off an air of confidence, and Maslow was stumped. He didn't know what to make of it, and he spent the rest of his career trying to figure it out. He thought that 80 to 90% of the tribe had achieved what he would later call self-actualization. 80 to 90% because of this quality. And he spent the rest of his life trying to figure out how to get that. What did the people and their experiences at Siksika have in common with the maybe 5% of people 5 to 10% of people in Maslow's population who are able to achieve the same sense of ego security without calling other people down. You know what he never considered? Localization, indigenization. He never considered that in a close-knit community where all of your ancestors forever were from here, and all of your descendants will forever be here, and you yourself and all, are here now with the people that you're going to know your whole life. And what good is it going to do in that kind of situation to be calling other people down to a stranger who's visiting for 6 weeks? It's kind of ridiculous. But it never entered his thoughts, and this is part of my response to the question, like, what's the difference between the local and the global? Well, some of it can be stuff like this, and it goes back to that reciprocation. In the global culture, we don't feel like we need to necessarily feed our relationships, because we can relationship hop, and these are all disposable. I can leave this job and fuck all of these people because there's another company I can work for and new relationships to be had. Let's move to a new surrogate family with each grade of our education. So it's trained detachment too. It's trained detachment when you're an earthling rather than a human. Maybe that's all I have to say now. I don't know, but I can continue walking. That's funny. Actually just got done peeing in front of this herd of deer myself. Now she's peeing in front of me. It's kind of funny how we'll do things in front of other animals that we won't do in front of our peers. Us humans, I mean. Those things probably are, more in our animal nature, and our culture is discouraging us revealing that animal nature. Now, what is she? Is she still eating leaves? You think? Looks like just surface stuff. What's on the surface around here? It's leaves. There's another pisser. Maybe they're all doing this on purpose now. Hey, let's get it back. Sniffing around. I think she's just smelling the urine from the other deer. Sorry, turned my head to look. I heard something. Leaves. It's gotta be, right?